There's been so much talk during this NBA Finals about injuries, whether it's guys who were previously injured and whether they're going to come back, to even new injuries that players have sustained during the finals. You guys have asked a lot of really great questions along the way about what's going on with all these different players, and so what I've decided to do is make one big kind of ultimate video looking at all of the big injuries that we're kind of following for both teams in the finals. We potentially have just one more game left, and so all the different injury status of these players is really key going into Game 5. Make sure you guys subscribe if you like this type of content and want to stay up to date with future videos. Help share this, get the word out about this page, and let's get to it. Your ultimate guide to injury statuses for the 2019 NBA Finals. On the Warriors side, we're going to take a look at Kevon Looney, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, and Demarcus Cousins. For the Raptors, we'll talk about what could be going on with Kawhi, OG Anunoby's status of coming back, what happened with Fred VanVleet the other day, and then finally what's still going on with Kyle Lowry's thumb. Timeline here so you guys can skip ahead if you want to see a particular player's status and what I have to say about it. Let's get to it. Starting off with Kevon Looney. So he was injured back in Game 2 after falling and landing pretty hard on his back. The initial word right away was a clavicle or a collarbone fracture, but then it quickly changed to a first costal cartilage non-displaced fracture. We initially thought he was going to be out for the rest of the season, but of course was able to return, and while dealing with quite a bit of pain, has been able to play in the rest of the finals. To understand his injury, we've got to quickly look at our anatomy of the ribs and kind of the rib cage. The ribs come around and insert on the sternum through actually a joint made up of cartilage. It's not just bone to bone. There's a piece of cartilage that connects it called the costal cartilage. At rib 1, it's more of a firm rigid attachment called a synchondrosis, but at ribs 2 through 7, it's actually a synovial joint, similar to something like your knee. Whenever you land, take some sort of trauma, get hit, or whatever, like what happened with Looney, all that force gets transferred through the ribs, and there was a fracture at that area of cartilage between where the first rib connects to the sternum or the breastbone. The fact that it was non-displaced is really good. That means everything stayed in alignment even though there was a fracture. And after a lot of talk, the medical team determined that it really couldn't be made any worse, and so they let him return to play. Reportedly for him, the only concern is pain, and so part of this they help manage by wearing a compression vest that helps keep those joints and helps keep the ribs in place more. Thankfully for him, there's not as much pain associated with higher level rib fractures like this, because whenever you breathe, the upper ribs don't expand as much as your lower ribs do. There's some thought that you can do a local anesthetic injection to try to help with the pain, but in a survey of some professional NFL teams, even some of those medical staffs didn't even offer these anesthetic injections because they didn't really think it was that worthwhile given the possible risk. I don't know if the Warriors are doing this or not, but whenever you inject anesthetic by the rib, you run a risk of putting the needle too deep and then puncturing the lung, giving him something called a pneumothorax. Now, the premise for him returning is that the medical staff feels he can't make this any worse. And while he's just playing, that's true, but if he were to take another shot, if he were to fall and land again and cause that non-displaced fracture to suddenly become displaced, then you run the risk of much worse things happening. That piece of cartilage can go through and puncture the lung, giving you a collapsed lung, and you can have other complications, especially higher up, where all the blood vessels are flowing by those ribs. So yeah, if he doesn't get hit, if he doesn't take any really hard shots or fall and land on his back, he'll probably be just fine and try to just manage the pain. But if he does take a hit or get some sort of additional trauma, he is at risk of things potentially becoming displaced or breaking more. Next up is Klay Thompson, who of course is dealing with a hamstring strain. He suffered the injury back in Game 2 after landing pretty awkwardly on a shot, missed one game, but then was able to return in Game 4 and should be back for Game 5. He claimed that the injury didn't really affect him at all, and that's certainly possible depending on how mild the strain was. But the injury was back on June 2nd, and if we look at when Game 5 is, he's going to have roughly around 8 days or so of recovery from the time that he first heard it. Depending on what source you look at, there can be really broad ranges of return to play time for a hamstring strain. There's some studies that looked at return to play in people who had a grade 2 strain or more severe strain than what Thompson appeared to have, and return around 13 to 15 days. And so he's only at 8 days, so there's probably still some residual effect that's hampering him a little bit going forward. After the initial rest phase when dealing with a hamstring injury, there's 3 kind of key strengthening exercises you might read about that are part of that return to play rehabilitation protocol. One of the exercises is called the extender, where you lay flat on your back with your unaffected leg flat on the ground. And then while supporting your affected leg, you flex your hip up towards you and then gradually extend your knee to help kind of stretch and strengthen some of that leg muscle. The next one is called the diver, where you're trying to place an eccentric strengthening on that affected hamstring. So you stand on your affected side, take your other leg off the ground, and then bend forward at the waist while extending the unaffected leg backwards, all the time trying to eccentrically load that affected hamstring. The third one is called the glider. That's basically a sort of front split with the injured leg in the front, the unaffected leg in the back on kind of a loose, slippery surface. And you do a front split gradually going backwards to help again try to strengthen and rehab that hamstring. So these are probably a component of some of what he's been doing for his recovery for this hamstring, but as well as he was able to play on it game 4, he's now had some additional time to rest and so should theoretically be doing even better. Still though, there's probably some residual effect and you've got to watch for other injuries in that kinetic chain involving the knee, the hip, the ankle, as the leg is trying to compensate from a probably still affected hamstring. Now the one that you guys probably all jumped to and wanted to hear about the most, Kevin Durant. As you know, Durant's been dealing with a calf strain and hasn't played now on coming up just over a month. At the time, they made it sound like it was a very mild injury, which usually has recovery in the order of just a couple to a few weeks, but as evidenced by his prolonged absence, this injury is either more severe than we thought or is just taking him more time to recover. Most likely it's the latter, that he's just not recovering as quickly as they would like, which is delaying his return. We found out today that he was cleared for practice, but then there was some speculation that it might have ended pretty quick or might not have gone well, so we'll have to see what his status is actually going to be for game 5, depending on how that practice went. There's a lot of speculation though about could this be worse, could this be an Achilles injury that they're trying to cover up, and I don't necessarily think that's true. I want to give you some insight into how this rehab process works so that you can better understand the steps that he's trying to go through that determine his return to play. Calf strains are rehab pretty similar to an Achilles injury. The first step is just, can you walk without a limp? Once you're able to walk without a limp, they'll then look at how you're doing with some light jogging with heel lifts in the shoe to help try to relieve some of the stretch on the muscle. If you can jog lightly without pain, then it's a question of if you can do a heel raise. If you're able to do all of these, then it's probably a much more mild injury with rehab on the order of just weeks as opposed to a month or more. Once players can do heel lifts without significant pain, then they progress through what we call the Alfredson protocol that's oftentimes used and researched with Achilles injuries. This is a series of eccentric heel drop exercises that are done over time to help strengthen and improve the function of that Achilles complex, and in this case, the calf muscle. Eccentric movements are whenever the muscle is lengthened over a constant tension. And so if you step on your stair and then slowly lower your heels down, you're stretching your calf muscle under the constant load of your body weight. You go one side at a time, eccentrically lower your heel down, and then you go back on both feet to push back up, and again, eccentrically lower down. In this specific protocol, you're often doing 3 sets of 15, so 45 reps with both your knee straight and your knee bent to help target all the muscles in the calf complex. And you do this twice a day, so roughly 180 repetitions. And it should be a little bit uncomfortable. It shouldn't be completely pain-free. If you get to the point where it is completely pain-free, then you can start adding some additional weight. But after you're able to progress through this protocol, then it's a question of starting to run on a flat surface. Once you can start running on a flat surface, then you can start incorporating full activities like basketball. But if you just look at the general population in terms of your average weekend warrior who this happens to, it's usually not that quick of a return just because they don't have all that direct attention and treatment like a pro athlete does. So whenever we think about what's taking it so long for him to come back, he's probably just having continued symptoms as he's trying to progress through these different stages. If you're not able to progress through doing these eccentric Alfredson type protocol activities, then you can't progress to running on flat ground and you can't progress to playing basketball. So it's a series of checkpoints that he has to hit. And I'm not gonna speculate on what could be going on with if he's actually hurt, if he's just kind of playing it off because of free agency. Let's assume he actually is hurt, and these are all pretty legit reasons for why it could be taking longer. Even if he does get back on the court for game 5, certainly Kevin Durant at 50% is better than no Kevin Durant, but if he's at 50% because he's still having pain in his calf, he makes himself more prone to worsening his calf injury or even causing an Achilles injury, which then sets him back a whole other length of time and could be more devastating for his long-term career. So for his own sake, I'm sure he cares about winning, but he also wants to protect his long-term health here. Next up, Demarcus Cousins. So he had that devastating quad injury earlier in the playoffs that then caused him to miss a bunch of time, but he was able to come back for the start of the finals. Had a good game pretty early on, but lately just hasn't quite had that jumping ability. Hasn't had that speed, the movement that he really needs to compete out there, and has really struggled as of late. This could be due to multiple things. It's possible that he just doesn't quite have that strength back in the quad, and so he doesn't have that jumping ability. But it could also be a factor that when you're out of high basketball activity for so long, you don't quite have your conditioning, you don't quite have that basketball stamina and endurance to really be able to play that full length of time. As he's tried to rehab this quad injury, it's possible that other things could just be more sore as he's tried to go through this therapy and rehab protocol. So there could be other aches and stuff that are really bothering him and affecting him more than we would have thought. Moving on to the Raptors, let's start off with Fred VanVleet. So everybody saw him take that elbow to the face in Game 4, bloody up his eye, require stitches, and get a piece of his tooth knocked out. Supposedly he didn't have a concussion, which the way he looked when he was laying on the floor, I kind of find it hard to believe, but trust their medical staff that they did their appropriate due diligence to rule out a concussion, and there shouldn't be any long-term implications of him coming back in terms of Game 5. The big thing I want to touch on with his injury for you all is, what do you do if your tooth gets knocked out while you're playing sports or whatever the case? If it's one of your baby teeth while you're really little, it's not going to go back in. Just leave it out. Don't worry about it. But if it's one of your adult teeth, sometimes they actually can be salvaged. There's a roughly 30-minute time window that you have to try to get to a dentist to get it reimplanted, and so what you should do, if possible, is put it right back in place. Get some moist gauze and try to bite down to keep it in place, and try to get to a dentist as soon as possible. If for swelling, bleeding, whatever reason you can't get it back in place, then you can actually put it in a glass of milk, and that's better than nothing, and then try to get to that dentist again around that 30-minute window to try to save the tooth. But again, don't see any long-term implication in terms of how he might do in Game 5, since he was not diagnosed with a concussion. Now with Kawhi, I really don't even know where to begin or where to start on this one, and we're probably going to find out more after the season about what exactly was bothering him, but seems to clearly be hampered by this quad or by the leg. We've seen him limping around a lot, we've seen him grabbing at it, and just not quite having that same pop and speed like we're used to seeing with him. You'll recall this was a big issue back when he was in San Antonio. Was it the quad muscle? Was it the quad tendon? What was going on? He was sitting out for a long time. And during the regular season, they did a really great job in terms of load management to try to limit the amount of stress and force either on his quad tendon, or just on his knee in general. Most likely this is some continuation of whatever he was dealing with last season that just really hasn't fully resolved and is still hampering him. But so far he's played really well during the finals, considering how hampered he looks to be. And so unless something severe or drastic happens during Game 5, I wouldn't expect his status to really change that much. The longer the series is to go though, the more load you're putting on that knee or on that leg, and so it could just slow him down a little bit more if this does go to a Game 6 and a Game 7. So I'm sure the Raptors are eager to get this over with just for that sake. If you remember though, with Victor Oladipo this year, he was dealing with problems with his knee, and then we of course saw that he ruptured his quad tendon. This is the risk you run, and this is why they're trying to do things like load management to limit that load on his structures. Oladipo was suffering with knee pain, kind of in, kind of out, and then his tendon completely ripped because it just wasn't healthy. So that's the one risk that you're at if there is injury further to his quad tendon, his patellar tendon, that something like a rupture or a worsening strain could occur if he continues to play on it like he is. Long term though, they've really got to address whatever the heck is going on with his biomechanics. If this is an extension of what he was dealing with the Spurs, this has really become a very prolonged and chronic thing that you can't expect to just suddenly get better unless something different is done. I don't know what the answer is, and until we have more info about what specifically he's dealing with, we probably won't know, but I can guarantee they're gonna really look at his biomechanics and how he's moving in the offseason to try to really fine tune and assess what could be causing this kind of continuous chronic issue with whatever's going on in his leg or his knee. Next up, OG Anunoby. So it's been a long time since we've seen him after his emergency appendectomy for appendicitis. He was active for Game 2 and 3, but it looked like was out for Game 4, and we haven't really heard much yet about what his status is for Game 5, but the fact that he hasn't been on the court so long, I really wouldn't expect him to be that much of an impact if he did come back. Appendicitis is inflammation of your appendix, which is a little outpouching near the large intestine in the colon. Appendicitis doesn't always require emergency surgery, and so the fact that he had an emergent appendectomy implies that there might have actually been a rupture of his appendix. If that was the case, it's a more extensive surgery. You're going to be out longer. It's usually a bigger incision. And so whatever they had to do, the fact that he hasn't been able to return is a question of healing from his surgery. You've got to make sure that the incision heals up really nice so that nothing rips. And if they had to do any sewing on his intestine, again, that's not something you can risk taking a shot, taking a hit to the stomach, and then having a rupture and much more complication. So this isn't really a basketball thing. This is just a question of, similar to if you or I had our appendix burst and had to go in for surgery, we'd be out for a pretty long time, let alone if we were trying to play at a high level in the NBA Finals. So we'll see what his status is going to be for Game 5, but again, I wouldn't really expect him at this point to even be back, just because of how long he's been out and how well the Raptors have been doing without him. They don't want to put him at worse risk of further injury if something did happen from that surgery. Last but not least is Kyle Lowry and his thumb. So I did a full video on this that you can go watch if you want to get more details on when it happened, how it happened, and so on. But there's been further talk and reporting that he will in fact need some sort of surgery after the season's over, and they've just been managing the pain with things like injections. If you recall from my previous video, I talked about this thing called a Sutterer lesion. A Sutterer lesion is whenever you get a complete rupture of the UCL ligament in the thumb joint, and part of one of the muscles in the thumb kind of gets caught underneath that ligament so that it can't properly heal. If this happens, you almost always need surgery to go in and actually repair it so that ligament can heal. So this could possibly be part of what's going on that might require surgery. Either way though, playing with it, he's not really gonna make anything worse. If something's completely torn or damaged, you're not gonna tear it anymore if it's already completely severed. It's just a question of managing the pain and trying to adapt with having this splint on your thumb. But we'll see after the season when we get kind of further word about what happened, what type of surgery he had to have done, if this was in fact what was going on, or if it was something different. All right, that's it. We covered a lot of different players, a lot of different injuries that we're following during this finals. Kind of brief, but I hope you all learned something about what could be going on with these different players, what might be keeping them out for so long, and hopefully learn something more about kind of the rehab protocols and what they're trying to work on as they get back. I really don't want basketball to end. This series has been great. It's been a really fun season, but we'll see if the Warriors are able to take Game 5 and send this to a Game 6, or if the Raptors close it out and become the next champions. Let me know more questions, comments you guys have below about these players, other players, different questions, thoughts you have. And until next time, thanks as always for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one. Bye.